Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. If you're just joining us, please take a second to introduce yourself in the chat box, and we will be getting started in just a few moments.
Hello, everyone. This is Jenny Scala, and I'm with REL Midwest. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us today to participate in our webinar focused on career readiness and college readiness for American Indian students. Today, we are quite fortunate to have a great agenda and presenters. And if I could have the next slide, please. So I am really pleased to introduce the two other presenters that will be on our session today. We've got Amanda Ticini, and she'll introduce herself, as well as Tammy Johnson. And I am, as I said, Jenny Scala, and I'm the partnership facilitator for our Midwest Career Readiness Research Alliance. And the next slide gives just a brief overview of our agenda today. So our agenda today is broken up so that we have lots of opportunity for questions and answers, as well as grounding some of our conversation in our presenters' content that they'll be sharing. However, if you have questions between the times that it's not question and answer time, feel free to enter them in the chat box that I see flashing, so it looks like people are already starting to use that feature. But before we go into any more content, Cora, my colleague, is going to give a brief overview to the platform that we're using today for this webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny. Yes, my name is Cora Golston, and I'm going to just introduce you to some of the features of the Zoom platform. So I know that a few people have joined us already in the chat box. So if you haven't found that option yet, you can just click on the chat icon to introduce yourself. If you have any questions for the presenters, you can share them in there. You can also let us know about any technical issues. You'll just want to make sure that when you're entering something into the chat box, that on the to line, you select to all participants and, or I'm sorry, all panelists. If it's like a technical question, if you want to introduce yourself, you can also share with all panelists and attendees as well. If you're not already connected to audio for the webinar, but you've logged in online, you can click Join Audio in the Zoom toolbar, and you'll see the icon here. You have two options. You can join audio over the phone, and there's a dial-in number, or you can also join with your computer speakers as well. And one wonderful benefit that we have is that we also have live closed captioning available for the webinar. So if you'd like to see those captions, you can just click on the closed caption icon. So with that, I will pass it back over to Jenny.
Great, thank you, Cora. So just a few slides about who we are and how we're able to provide this opportunity to folks today. So we are with the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest. You can see the map of the United States is broken up into 10 different groups here because there are 10 different regional education laboratories. And these laboratories, or we affectionately call them RELs, are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. However, we know that while we're focused in those Midwest states, that there are people that are on this call from all over the country that we're really great that everyone is able to join us today. So the next slide provides just a little bit of information about whom the RELs in our REL Midwest works with. So as you can see at the bottom part of your screen, that lists the 7 states that are in our region, our Midwest region. And then above that, you'll see the types of people that we really work with in our efforts to support what's going on in states in terms of education. So school districts, state education agencies, and other education organizations. And then the next slide discusses what we actually do. So we're a federally funded group that we applied the research, and then we take some of that research and say, how can we help support that through technical assistance and other engagement activities like our webinar today. And more specifically on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of information about the types of partnerships that we have. This partnership is the one that's highlighted in yellow, the Midwest Career Readiness Research Alliance, but we do have a few others within our regional education lab in the Midwest. You'll see some of those research alliances on the left, and then we also have one networked improvement community focused on work in Iowa. And then more specific information about the Career Readiness Research Alliance is on this slide. So the goal of our alliance is really to help explore the post-secondary readiness and pathways for students, focusing on an understanding the opportunity gaps that are experienced by students in the state of Minnesota, specifically looking at students in rural districts, and this includes American Indian students. We are focused predominantly in Minnesota, but we also have a community of practice to support other states within the region, and then we do engagement opportunities like today, where we're able to broadcast and share information to a larger setting. And so with that, I'm really happy to hand this over to the first presenter.
Thank you. Yeah, şey nerede taçini şey, nanış acı taçini nişlo, özüslanı başı çin, sabah daşı çay ado aşiya daşanalı, look antianasha. Hello, my name is Amanda Taccini. I am Navajo, originally from Ganado, Arizona, a rural town located on the Navajo Nation. I'm Zuni, red running into water clan, born for the mini goats clan. My maternal grandfather's clan is water at the edge, and my paternal grandfather's clan is salt. I am extremely thrilled and full of gratitude that you are joining us on today's webinar that is focused on preparing American Indian students for college and career readiness. Many of you will agree with me that this is a very important topic that too often does not get the attention it deserves. I want to thank Regional Educational Laboratory, Midwest, for bringing us together today. The title of my presentation is from Babakiri High School, a public school located on the Tohono-O'odham Nation that enrolls and graduates a large number of Native students. The statement, as you can see on the slide, strengthening our sovereign nation, is posted in a visible place at the high school. It is a powerfully culturally relevant message that speaks to our efforts to increase opportunities for Native students. In this discussion, I will briefly share some history, provide social cultural context that are facing Native communities, and touch on culturally responsive schooling as a means toward advancing our work and preparing Native students for the future. Next slide, please. It is a delicate balance to portray the complex realities of diverse Native communities. I want to stress that Native peoples are vastly diverse and should not be generalized or essentialized to reflect a monolithic imagery. Native peoples represent a thriving people who have withstood and continue to withstand colonization and oppressive injustices. I strive to follow Dr. Malia Valega's perspective to telling our stories with love, by not only presenting data that often conjures deficit orientation, but also sheds light on today's conditions that are intimately connected to societal economic context that is rooted in historical United States policies. Next slide. In 2014, former President Barack Obama stated, Native youth and Native education are in a state of emergency. It is fair to say that Natives have been in a state of emergency since colonization. Next slide. At a national level, Native students have a 68% high school graduation rate, a 53% graduation rate for those attending rural Indian education schools. When we review Native high school graduation rates in the Midwest and Central states, we can see variations, with Indiana at 84%, which is above the national rates at 82% for all students, and South Dakota at 47%. I encourage you, if you don't know already, to take a look at your state, school district, institution, organization, and see what the numbers tell you for Native students. First, ask yourself, do we collect this data? And if so, how do we collect this data? And then ask yourself, what other measurements are missing that can tell us a more loving understanding of Native experiences? Next slide. Of those Native students that do graduate from high school, 20% will go on to college. The immediate college enrollment rate for high school completers was 40% in 2015 for all children. For American Indian Alaskan Native students, that rate is nearly half at 23%. And when you look at the graph presented for American Indian and Alaskan Native students, they had the largest decline from 2010 and 2015. We know that the economic recession occurred and that college tuition rates increased during that same period, which may speak to some of that decline. This may be true, but we need to do more research to investigate this further. Next slide, please. As the general Native population increased from 2000 to 2010 by 39%, college enrollment and degrees conferred in that same period remained at 1%. This illustrates a 1% stagnation crisis. Next slide. Let me be clear. When viewing these data sets and raw numbers without understanding the context is very problematic. there is a tendency to place the spotlight on the individual Native student and dismiss the larger historical and societal structures that are intimately at play. Next slide. And then there's another challenge to large data sets. Too often, Native peoples are represented with an asterisk, which denotes the invisibility of Native representation in educational conversations, because their numbers are so small that many argue they cannot be studied. Scholars such as Dr. Heather Schotten, Dr. Stephanie Waterman, and Shelley Lowe are asserting that more work is needed to move beyond the asterisk. Next slide. And in moving beyond the asterisk, we must assert that history and social cultural context matters. I will briefly touch upon these areas, and I encourage you to explore more to better understand the complexity surrounding Native education. Next slide. These maps show the transfer of Native land to the federal government from 1850 to 1990. The red portions indicate lands held by Native peoples. It's important to note here that the maps do not demonstrate the important connection and dimensions between Native identity and their belonging to an environment and place. When working with Native peoples, it's imperative that a deeper awareness of indigeneity and land be understood and acknowledged. Next slide. Between the years of 1787 and 1871, more than 150 treaties were signed and entered into by the federal government and Native nations. This established a trust relationship wherein which the U.S. government and trade for appropriating land were responsible for the social well-being of Native peoples. Among a combination of trust responsibilities, education was included in treaty agreements. Next slide. It's important to note that the federal government implies tribal sovereignty, but tribal nations believe that sovereignty is inherent. In 1942, Felix Cohen, the author of Federal Indian Law, wrote, "Indian sovereignty is the principle that those powers which are lawfully vested in Indian country are not in general delegated powers granted by express acts of Congress, but rather inherent powers of a sovereignty which has never been extinguished." Next slide. During the late 1800s, the motto, "Save the man, kill the Indian," propagated by Richard Pratt, illustrated Eurocentric ideals to educate Native people. Boarding schools were established to educate and assimilate Native children into Eurocentric standards. Countless Native children endured trauma, abuse, illness, and death at these boarding schools. Dr. Shanina Lomo-Waima and others have written extensively of this period. And Dr. Lomo-Waima and Dr. Teresa McCarty's book titled "To Remain an Indian, Lessons in Democracy from a Century of Native American Education," they stated, "Native reminiscences of boarding school life are full of tears shed in private." Next slide. There is much to learn and discuss regarding the history of Native peoples. The very brief history that I shared with you sets the backdrop of the social cultural context of today. I'm going to transition and talk about the social conditions facing many Native peoples today. Let me remind you here that the data I will share with you are interconnected and linked to systemic constraints rooted in historical and current politics. Nationally, in 2015, the median household income from Native populations was at $38,000 compared to $55,000 for the United States. 28% of Natives live below the poverty level, which is double the national average of 14%. 35% of Native children under 18 live in poverty compared to 21% for all and 12% for white. Next slide. The national Native unemployment rate is 12%, double the national rate of 6%. However, unemployment is not a clear picture because it measures a person's effort to seek jobs that are assumed to already exist. For many Native people who reside on rural reservations, job availability is scarce and difficult to access. Moreover, poverty rates are at much higher rates than rural reservations, with some areas with rates that are 4 times the national average. Research has proven that higher educational attainment levels are related to economic gain. Recall the previous slides at the beginning of this presentation where I described educational attainment levels across demographics? When students do not complete high school and receive a college degree, the ability to gain employment is more challenging. Next slide. I wanted to also include in this discussion health concerns because health, our well-being is also linked to educational outcomes. Among Native youth 10 to 19 years old, type 2 diabetes is nearly 3 times the national average and 5 times higher than among white youth. Native youth are more likely to have used an illegal drug, smoked cigarettes, and participated in binge drinking in the past 30 days than any other racial ethnic group. Next slide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Native youth. These statistics are really difficult to swallow, but are the reality of what many of our Native youth are facing. Historical trauma, defined by Mary Yellow Horse Braveheart, is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences, has been referred to explain the challenges Natives are facing today. Some scholars have critiqued that historical trauma fails to recognize existing structural factors that contribute to current problems, as well as minimizes the strengths of Native people. I want to point out here that systemic poverty and structural forces influence the well-being of people. Next slide. Some structural barriers may include suspension, expulsion, and threats that are occurring in school settings. Native youth, males specifically, are more likely to be expelled from school and have a higher rate of being threatened or injured with a weapon or on school property. And these statistics do not get any better when we discuss those that go to prison. Native Americans are incarcerated at a rate 38% higher than the national average. Native men are incarcerated at 4 times the rate of white men, and Native women are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white women. Next slide. Racism, marginalization, stereotypes, and oppression, invisibility are all being experienced by Native students right now at schools, neighborhoods, streets, college campuses, playgrounds, in our backyards, and on our televisions and internet. All of these are compounded barriers that are shaping Native students every single day. Next slide. Yet, much hope lies ahead for us. You will learn more about specific examples by Tammy Johnson as she shares her work within the Minneapolis public schools. What I will do is briefly talk about that hope and possibility, specifically when culture responsive schooling is employed. Next slide. Many of us can agree with Alaskan native Okako, Leona Okako. She states, "To me, educating a child means equipping him or her with the capability to succeed in the world he or she will live in. Education is more than book learning, it is value learning. And this idea of value learning is a vital aspect of culturally responsive education, wherein which we place prominence in the values of Indigenous peoples in our efforts, particularly when engaging in college planning and practice." Next slide. Culturally responsive education recognizes, respects, and uses students' identities and backgrounds as meaningful sources for creating optimal learning environments. Having a firm grounding in the culture of Indigenous students helps to identify the appropriate qualities and practices implemented. Responsive is action-oriented, and that taking actions to address Indigenous students' needs are at the forefront. This may be taking a change in how we typically do our work. Culturally responsive education provides opportunities to learn more about the students and their lives and be flexible, adaptable, creative in the process. This also may mean more time is needed to prepare, think through, and implement practices and teachings. Next slide. Being culturally responsive is more than being respectful, empathetic, or sensitive. Accompanying actions such as having high expectations for students and ensuring that these expectations are realized are what make a difference. This means believing in Native students' capacity and abilities to be their best selves, whether that is going to college or the workforce. In some of the research that I have conducted, high-achieving Native students express frustrations with the schools they attended because their schools do not challenge them or even talk to them about college possibilities. They share that schools are in a deficit mindset and focus too often upon getting students to graduate from high school rather than placing attention on preparing them to go to college. Next slide. Dr. Angelina Cascago, empirical research has found remarkable gains when culturally responsive schooling are woven into the educational outcomes. Native students have enhanced self-esteem, develop healthy identity formations, are more self-directed and politically active, have a positive influence on their tribal communities, and achieve academically at higher rates. In Dr. Angelina Castagno and Dr. Brian Bravo's article titled Culturally Responsive Schooling for Indigenous Youth, a review of the literature, they discussed that 3 topics are not mentioned in much of the college culturally responsive schooling: sovereignty, racism, and epistemologies. And that in moving forward, we must incorporate and acknowledge sovereignty, racism, and epistemologies in our research and practice. Next slide. In this work, we must keep in mind the following. Recognize the error of viewing learners to one-dimensional generalizations. For example, viewing all Native students as silent and shy, this is not always true. And we must strive to see the multi-dimensional perspectives, behaviors, and attitudes of Native students. We must not focus too much attention on the student, or in some cases, the subject, the program, the class, but also focus on the larger systems: teachers, administrators, school and educational norms, tribal, state, and federal policies. This is a good reminder because much of the work that we do, this is me included, is focused on our efforts in the classroom or in the program that we are running. This is all good work that we are striving to do at the ground level, but we need to also be vigilant about looking at the larger structural policies. Cultural responsive education allows us to learn more about the students we serve. Do not teach our children our culture. Use our culture to teach them is an important reminder for all of us. Next slide. For the work that we do in college and career pathways, we must consider history and social cultural context matters. Consider how you are utilizing that knowledge to inform your programming and planning. This means doing homework, your homework. Learn about the historical background of the Native students that you are working with. Be informed about societal conditions impacting their lives by reading tribal papers and getting connected to tribal-specific social media feeds. It means being invited and going and attending local community events and taking the time and interest to build and foster relationships with community members and organizations. How are you utilizing cultural responsive approaches in college and career readiness? This may mean having conversations with Native students and their families, listening to their thoughts about college and career readiness. Take the time to use that information to strengthen that work, and then return to the students and families again to see if you're addressing and meeting their needs and interests. Incorporate sovereignty, epistemologies, and acknowledgement of racism in college and career readiness activities, goals, and services. There are great programs like College Horizons, American Indian College Fund's Native College Pathways, and University of Colorado Boulder's Upward Bound program that are incorporating culturally responsiveness in their practices. These programs are spreading the message to Native college-going students that education is a means towards strengthening our sovereign nation. And that message, at the title of this presentation, in of itself is an example of being culturally responsive. Next slide, and final slide. If we want to do better as a nation for our Native students, we must stress that students will learn better and be more engaged in schooling when they can make connections to it.
Thank you, Amanda. You covered a lot of information, which we really appreciate. We did get a couple of questions, and if we, as you have some questions, to those of you that are participating, feel free to enter them into the chat window. One of the earlier questions was actually on what ideas you have and suggestions for how to reduce the high suicide rate among Native American males.
I thank you for addressing that question. That is a topic actually that's been pressing on my heart over the last few years. And so I've been doing some of my own learning. I think one of the things too is really learning to some great people that are doing that work and being familiarized with it. Trying to recall his name. In Alaska, they're launching right now a film that's going to come out about Native youth suicide. And they're doing some really great work up there in Alaska addressing suicide. And much of what I'm understanding is really including cultural responsive ways of knowing and instilling strength within and the youth there in that area. And so my recommendation is, and this is what I'm doing too, is really learning more about it because it's a really heavy subject and it's really hard to grapple with, but it's happening in our communities and our families. And so when I did speak with, and if I think of his name and it comes to my head, I'll put it in the chat box. I spoke with him privately after his keynote address. He spoke at the racial, ethnic, national conference, the INCORE conference. And I shared with him, how do you do this work? Kind of what you asked me. And he said, you know, it's important that if we're going to engage in this work as professionals, as family members, is that we also get strong in heart and mind as well, because it is really it's even hard to talk about it, especially within our community. And so that's something that I'm taking to heart is, you know, getting stronger in my faith and my spirituality and preparing for that work. Great question. Thank you for opening it up.
No problem. So we have a few other questions, and this one transitions a little bit, and we have another question that will transition back a little bit on the suicide, but we're going to take a little bit of a break on that and then come back to it. So one of our participants asked if there are local or statewide initiatives that structure pathways for Native students between high school and college and between tribal community colleges and four-year institutions.
So are there programs, like national programs?
Local or statewide?
Programs. There are some, I mentioned a few programs that are out there. So College Horizon, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with it. If you're not, they do a really great job nationally. Then they go throughout the nation at different states throughout the year. And it's a summer enrichment program for Native high school students to actually do the whole application process. And I follow them on social media, and they do such a fabulous job. And I've noticed particularly this year, they've done a lot of great work, culturally responsive ways of knowing in their programming. And in that, for example, they talk about encountering racism on college campuses. And I think that's unique because often those are the conversations we don't have in our planning and preparation. It's not something we want to talk about. We wish that it wasn't an area of a concern, but it's the reality of what our students face often when they go on college campuses. So they talk about those kinds of topics there. And so I would definitely encourage you to like their Facebook, their social media site, and share that with your students. Another one that is emerging out of the American Indian College Fund is the Native College Pathways that I mentioned, and they are doing some fabulous social media work as well, and they work primarily with tribal college students. engaging high school students to be in tribal college, to attend tribal college. And they do some fun videos where they actually have students who are going to tribal colleges do tours and video cam it. And so it's pretty cool because you get the students' perspective of a tour on a campus. And they not only do that, but they talk about different topics that are important, like financial aid and so forth. But they do it and tailored in a way that they speak to a native student audience. So off the top of my head, those are two programs that I'd like to re-share.
And I'm going to have just enough information to get dangerous, but there's also a program in Alaska. I believe it's with University of Alaska. I can't remember if it's Anchorage or Fairbanks. Slightly different, where they're actually trying to set aside housing for students, where Native American students are getting intentionally placed with their peers rather than being spread out among the kind of all of the students that are going to be in residential. So they're setting up essentially residential houses that are specific to different tribal students. And so they're able to have that additional support. And then they're also mentoring and asking someone who's been through the school to kind of be the host mom or host kind of RA, so to connect and to continue the cultural aspect for students once they're at school, knowing that that can be a big adjustment for Native American students. We did have a question about if, Amanda, you were trying to, or referring to Evan Peter from NCORE.
Yes, thank you, yes.
So one of our participants was able to kind of fill that in for us. And another participant, oh great, you guys are doing such a great job, thank you so much. I actually put in the chat box the link to the American Indian College Fund's Native Pathway to College. So we've got that link in the chat box for everybody. So it seems like we've got to move on to our next presentation. So keep your questions. We've got time. We've got another block of time, everyone. So we're writing them down. I have them right here. But with this, thank you, Amanda. We'll bring you back for the next question and answer. We're going to transition now for Tammy Johnson to talk more specifically about some of the work that's happening in Minneapolis. So Tammy, thank you so much for joining us, and here you go. Tammy, you're still muted. Sorry to interrupt.
There we go. Okay, you missed the best part already. But Chimagwich, Amanda, for sharing everything that you shared. Such amazing information that is really important for people to know. And Miigwech for everybody who's joining us here today. Next slide. Anin, Awanakwe, Indishnikaz, Gawabakanakag, Indojiba, Magazian Dudem. I'm Tammy Johnson. I'm a school counselor and I work with Minneapolis Indian Education Program, and I am from the White Earth Nation in northwestern Minnesota. Next slide. Next slide. Okay.
If we click through, I think there might just be a second of a lag. There we go.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is specifically our program here in Minneapolis and what we do with our Native American students, and give you some information that you can take with you and then access later regarding...
Tammy, sorry to interrupt again. I think I can't hear you, so I don't know if others are, if it's just me, I apologize for interrupting, but I'm going to...
Can you hear me now?
Okay, it's just me. I'll be quiet.
Okay. What I'm going to get into is details about what we're doing here in Minneapolis. We're seeing some improvements in our student graduation rate. And so a little bit about our district to start off with. We have, 36,000 students, and it varies each year, but between 3 and 4% are American Indians from multiple tribes across the country. Lakota and Ojibwe are the highest volume in our schools. In our program, we have 3 school counselors. 2 of us are at the high school. We have 2 social workers, a number of teachers who work with curriculum and staff development, and then we have associate educators that work a lot with our families, and then we have a linguist for our program. Next slide. Amanda had touched on earlier what the graduation rate looks like, and it does, in Minnesota, It's quite low compared to national averages, but within Minneapolis, it's even lower. But one of the things, because we want our students to understand this information, but we also want them to see the positive things that are coming from this and not just see that we're the lowest in the district or the lowest in the state or the country. When I came here to Minneapolis in 2010, our graduation rate was 17.2%. And from 2010 to 2015, we more than doubled our graduation rate. And it's been going pretty steadily up over the last few years. And we want our students to see this data and talk about that in terms of where we've seen improvements, because we have made great strides. In fact, from 2010 to 2013, we had the largest gains of any ethnic group in our district. And our students will say, yeah, but all we hear is the negative stuff. And so we really want to pointedly say, but we need to honor what we're doing instead of always buying into that, we're never good enough, we're not graduating high enough, and those negative perceptions that are too often put in the media, and we don't give ourselves credit for what we have done. So next slide. I want to point out that, a lot of the stuff that Amanda said that our students are dealing with, and sometimes, some days when they get out of bed, school is not the priority. Somewhere to live is a priority. Dealing with family situations, getting food, that's the priority for some of our students. And with all the other trauma and issues they're dealing with in their lives, if school has to take a back seat for a little bit, I'm okay as long as they're still encouraged and supported to reach graduation at their pace. So if we look at a 4-year graduation rate and a 5-year graduate from the same class of 2015, we do see an increase, and we'll see another increase for the 6-year graduation rate for that class. So in Minneapolis, even if we're making small gains, we're still making gains, but we have to understand and be patient with where our students are coming from. And I'm happy if they're still in school and they're still working at it. It means they're trying it, they haven't given up, and they will get there eventually. Next slide. When we work with our students, this is kind of the mantra that I like to come from the perspective of, and if you know what was taken away, then you can reclaim it. So our students really do need to know their history with education to find out where things went wrong. We used to have a very great love of traditional education, and for my people, it was the Klan system. And the Klan taught you everything you needed to know to be a good human being and to contribute to your community in a good way. And I think we lose touch with that because of our negative interaction once there was interaction with Europeans, and their style of education changed our view of education, our relationship with education, and our families so vastly. But I think we need to know, and our students need to know, what their history with education was in order for them to really own their education today and move forward. Next slide. In my work with students, a lot of times we will talk about the boarding school issues. And this is a quote from one of my students. I asked students to go back and talk to your family members of who was in a boarding school, and will they be willing to share with you what their memories or recollections are. For a lot of our students, this is the first time that they've ever had a conversation with their families, or their family members have ever spoken about their experience with boarding school. And this particular student, her grandfather had mixed reactions. He found some value in the things that he learned to deal with his life today. Next slide. But her grandmother really couldn't see a lot of positives in it. And the student reflected on how is their relationship with education or their experience still impacting me today. And she says, it affects me because I don't know my own language, and their purpose was to assimilate us, and it actually worked. Because I'm not who I should be. So when Amanda was talking earlier, some of these issues are very difficult to talk about with our students, but it's something that they need to talk about because we have to open something up, we have to name it before we can start healing from it. So a lot of our students walk around with that feeling in regards to education. They just don't feel comfortable at school. They don't feel comfortable in the class or with a certain teacher. And they have a hard time putting that into words. And culturally, they may want to avoid conflict, so they withdraw from that situation, withdraw from that teacher, that class, that school, and not resolve the issues, the underlying issues of why they're not comfortable there. So I think it's very important that we have that conversations with our students, and that teachers know that history of boarding schools for American Indian people. Next slide. So these next two slides are just a brief overview of what our counseling program is here in Minneapolis, and I'll go into that more later, but we're really a supplement and a complement to the work that our building counselors already do around their American school counseling standards. And in Minneapolis, it's called My Life Plan, where in middle school and high school, each month they're meeting with their counselors and working on a life plan lesson so that they can start planning for what they want to do after high school and learn about their options. Next slide. So these are just briefly what we do, and I'll go into more detail in the next few slides. So next slide. Everything that we do is through a native lens, and what that means to us is that it incorporates our history, our values, our culture, and our language. We're teaching a lot of the same things that they're getting from their building counselor, but we do it through their lens so that it's more approachable for our students. Next lens. Next slide. So specifically, we have college planning groups, and we don't really find a lot of curriculum that's out there for us to use readily, so we end up writing our own each year. We borrow and we adapt from other programs, but we really do have to write it out each year to keep it updated and for so it meets our student current needs. We do a lot of hands-on and physical activities. Usually in groups, counselors will do like one icebreaker. We find with our students, they need at least 2 or 3 for them to feel comfortable. So each week, the first 3 weeks, we'll do an icebreaker with students where they get to introduce themselves and share and learn about each other. And all of our group activities and our curriculum is written from a growth mindset. So we have to understand our history, but then to take ownership of that and move forward in a good way, we have to change how we think. Change how we think about ourselves in a lot of cases and the system that we're working in. So we do use a lot of psychology in that. We share data with our students. We share the slides about our graduation data, and we analyze that with them. But we also share data with students about the stuff that Amanda was sharing earlier about suicide rates and about college completion. And so we share a lot of that with students. So we have 8 to 10 sessions at the beginning of the year. Next slide. And again, through that native lens. This year we're exploring 7 grandfather teachings, and we incorporate Ojibwe and Dakota, which are the native languages here in Minnesota, as much as possible. We find that when we're working with students and there's a difficult situation to talk about, talking in the third person is often very helpful. Then the student can share and reveal without making it their own personal story. Next slide. So this is just a brief outline of what our lessons look like this year. This is 5 of our 8. And then I'm going to show you a lesson or an article that we're using called Throw Yourself In. Next slide. This is the American Indian Graduate Center's magazine. We use this to pull personal stories from all across the country. And in this particular story, Throw Yourself In, even though it's a young woman from the Navajo Reservation, she shares her experience, and throughout the story you can pick out all 7 of the grandfather teachings and how she uses that to make a decision for herself, for her family, and for her community. Next slide. So in the beginning of the year and heavily in the second semester, we really focus one-to-one support with our seniors. We help them with their tribal enrollment documentation. We do one-to-one FAFSA work with them until it's completed, even if that means after they've graduated into the next school year. We help them with ACT preparation, and we have our own scholarship database. And that's available on our website, and you'll see that link later. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So the other thing that we talk with students about is we have spring senior groups to help them with that transition of the things that Amanda had mentioned earlier, these microaggressions or racism that they might face at college, homesickness, how to handle roommate problems. And then we work with our seniors, our students, even after they graduate from high school. I have 2 seniors already this year who graduated 2 years ago, and they're off to college for the first time, and we're still helping them with their FAFSA. Next slide. So the other portion we do is professional development. So we actually teach our teachers and our incoming teachers from the University of Minnesota about the history of boarding schools and best practices in working with American Indian students. Next slide. And we also do financial aid workshops with teachers. And the new thing we've done in the last 2 years is we are training counselors and social workers on cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools to help deal with some of those things that are interrupting our students' educations, and the hope that our students are going to be able to progress in education a lot more quickly if they're dealing with some of the traumatic issues in their lives day to day. Next slide. And this is our website. You can go there and go under the College Readiness tab, and you'll find information. You'll find videos that our students have made that talk about what it means to be a community member, talks about the grandfather teachings, what supports they need for college, as well as our scholarship website. And then also on the website throughout this year, we will be uploading our actual lesson plans. So instead of just sharing that one quick one, you'll actually be able to grab that, that complete lesson plan off of our website in the future. And the rest of the resources here are just for your information if you want to learn more about the history of American Indian education in the United States. And then some resources you can use with students, including the American Indian Graduate School magazine that we use a lot for our groups.
Thank you, Tammy. So some of the questions that we've gotten, I think you might have hinted at some of the answers, but just for clarification. So one person was curious to know if you would be able to share this year and last year's college planning curriculum. Is that the curriculum that you were referencing will be posted on your website this year?
Yes, but we'll kind of be portioning it out throughout the year. So each quarter we have to upload about 2 lessons. You know, we just don't have the person power to get it all up there at once. So the goal is each quarter we'll get 2 of them up there. So yes, we will eventually have a lot more lessons available for people to use. I often share the scholarship database and some other lessons with other school counselors across my state through our organization. But if you definitely will have my email address, so if you want to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to send some along even earlier than you can access on our website.
Great, thank you. And then another question was looking to see if you had any recommended resources to prepare and assist Native staff and administrators to start the conversation about racism with other Native students.
So there's a librarian at the University of Minnesota, Jody, and I cannot think of her last name, but she works at the Wilson Library at the University of Minnesota, and she actually has a training that they do with all of their library staff on microaggressions, and it's a training that they were expanding to other U of M staff. I think she'd be, you know, if you want to email me, or if someone can pull it up on the website and get her contact info. We're going to try to work with her here in Minneapolis as well. So I think talking about those microaggressions is a good way to start that, how students can notice it, how they can identify it, and then how they gauge whether or not it's worth responding. So, for example, you may not want to confront your, you know, college professor the first day of class if you start to see things. You may want to wait. You may want to, you know, talk it over with other people. So they have a really good curriculum that they use with staff that I think would be a good start.
Great. And people are writing in some more questions. So thanks for all the questions, everybody. The next one is on how you address issues in Native communities with students, topics such as suicide, drug use, the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Not so much through my groups, but we do have student leadership organizations within the district who address a lot of those issues, and we have community partners here in Minneapolis that have those conversations with students. It's not always something that we can address in school time-wise, but also politically wise. So we really do rely on the student organizations to kind of push their agenda forward And then sometimes our community partners are the ones who can really help facilitate that for them, such as going to Standing Rock or that kind of thing.
And then are these supports provided for students in the 2 alternative schools that are part of the Minneapolis Public Schools?
Yes.
Excellent.
Our college groups are, yes. And then our 1-to-1 senior work, yes, those are provided as well.
Great. And then another question, you had mentioned the district's counseling program has a component of parent communication and collaboration with community members. And how are counselors building a rapport with parents and the community?
So that specifically for us is something that the counselors in the Indian Ed department work with our community partners on a number of things. We just had a training over the last 2 trainings in the last week on working better with American Indian students for teachers and educational assistants, and then we do a lot to help our schools facilitate communication with their families. We help send announcements out in our newsletter. We have Facebook, and then on our website as well. So if schools are having an event and they want families there, we can give an extra push for communication. We can do some coordinating with getting families involved, specifically in special education. We have a special education group that our social worker works with and actually transports families to these meetings. And so we do that work in that way.
Great. Then do you collect feedback from Native students who have been through the program to inform the future counseling lessons and the program moving forward?
We usually evaluate our students at the end of our groups to see how much knowledge they've retained and if they've had changes in attitudes or changes in their knowledge, but we haven't gone to that next step yet to evaluate like former students who've gone through who are at college.
Okay. And this next question might be for you as well as Amanda. We had a participant that just asked about what data that you have on the impacts of suicide or suicide attempts. What data do you have on the impacts of suicide or suicide attempts on other Native youth?
That might be Amanda. I can't think of anything off the top of my head of what resources you could go to find that out.
Hi, hey, yeah, I've been reading that and thinking about that question, and nothing comes to the top of my head, but I think that really calls upon the need to investigate that further, and also in regards to connecting it to education. However, I do want to mention that work is really going to need to be, and when we're talking about culturally responsive schooling, we also need to be aware of cultural responsive data collection and methodology and research practices. And so particular topics such as that is a really sensitive one, and should research be needed for that, we need to be mindful of the questioning, the protocol, and be culture responsive in that manner and gathering that information. It's very important. You need to better understand that topic. I think it makes me think about the work we need to do to draw relationships with other sectors, educators, public health researchers, and so forth. I'm sure there's good work out there, and so it's really digging in there and digging a little bit more into what we could do to help our Native youth, our people.
Great, thank you. Tammy, we had one other question asking if you would be comfortable sharing the assessments that you mentioned in terms of how you, at the end of each cycle with students that just finished the sessions, and how you collect information on what their perceptions were of the program and the information difference.
Yeah, so the evaluations that we use at the end, they're part of the curriculum. So if somebody wanted to email me and get the lesson plans from previous years, we'll have it's a really brief evaluation in there of what the students retained. And then we also play Jeopardy on the computer. So each category of sessions that we had information on, and then the students compete as groups to play Jeopardy and see what they recalled from the year.
Great, thank you. And we did have a participant who just wrote in that SAMHSA has suicide data and impact on Native youth. So that's something that we'll make sure that we can share some of those links as well to everybody. Let me see. I think we're close to answering all of the questions that we've gotten. I'm going to kind of stutter for a little bit to see if anybody has any additional questions.
Jenny, can I one thing?
And I think what I'm going to do is I'll start to wrap up if we can go to the next slide. And if there are any additional final questions as they come in, I'll circle back to them. So first, I want to thank our presenters so very, very much for being willing to share the information that they've both shared on our webinar today. We really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much. I know in the chat box, one of my colleagues has just put both Amanda and Tammy's email addresses up. So if you have questions, you can email them directly. Their email addresses are there. The session today has been recorded. It is currently being recorded, and we will be sending that out along with slides to everybody who has registered for the event. So even if they weren't able to participate live, they will get the link to the recording and information as well. And so we actually have so before I see one additional question that we'll answer, but before I do that, I do want to just point out that we do have Twitter and website for more information and additional resources that you can follow along. We also have a couple of screenshots of some of our pieces up on the slide as well. We have a question, and I'm actually going to see if one of our colleagues can also answer this one, about whether or not the educational labs ever partner with area health education centers. And I think that would actually really depend on the area and what the question and the practice that you are trying to address. I think that's something that definitely we would be interested in exploring further. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. My email address is also on the slides at the beginning, I believe, as well. So thank you all very, very much for participating in our webinar today. We really appreciate it. There's my email address. I'm on the bottom, Jenny Scala. So thank you again for all your time and effort. We really appreciate it. Amanda and Tammy, thank you again so very much. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for participating.
Thank you.